At a ball game, the rebels watch the knights in their private box, hoping to convince Tiger to defect. Taking a guard hostage, they head to the box, but Ram being there doesn't help matters. Nor does the silent alarm being tripped, forcing the rebels to run. Bromley's hit and caught, and Ram convinces Tiger they were planning to kidnap him. Meanwhile, Spider-Man's putting his suit through a stress test after a fight with Venom. We'll get to that. Following that, he joins Nalco and Shane as Peter to enjoy Carnival, though he worries he's starting to get too attached. A group of bestials start to cause trouble. Peter switches back to Spider-Man and tries to calm things down. Things get complicated when he spots Bromley, so he grabs him and flees. Bromley leads Spidey to an abandoned station. They're trapped by a wall and machine men approach. The wall's also electrified, as Spidey quickly finds out. He's able to use that against the machine men at least. Too bad for him, this was all a trap set by Bromley. Spidey wakes up strapped to a table and surrounded by the knights. The High Evolutionary plans to have him transported to Wundagore Castle, but Ram intends to implement some mind control first. Bromley decides he can't take seeing Spidey being tortured, so breaks him free. Taking a breather, Bromley tells Spidey about how he's old enough to have lived in New York before High Evolutionary's takeover. He turns Spidey over as Ram gave him a ring belonging to his brother Durwood, who's apparently working as a slave in Wundagore Castle. Spidey's not happy about being betrayed, but decides to help Bromley break Durwood out. The pair manage to sneak inside by hijacking a laundry van. Unfortunately, Vermin's patrolling inside and picks up Spidey's scent. He engages in some quick flirting with her, allowing Bromley to get safe. Spidey rejoins him as Vermin heads off to make herself look good for him. Discovering a water treatment plant, they spot Durwood among the workers. Durwood's happy to see his brother again, especially because he can trade a rebel for a position in the upper city. The High Evolutionary also appears, revealing he's able to throw telekinetic punches. As the two brothers fight, Spidey's knocked into a machine that starts to turn him into a spider bestial. Realising it's powered by sonic waves, he activates his own sonics to counter it. The machine's destroyed and Spidey's no worse for wear. Bromley overpowers Durwood, accidentally knocking him into a water tank, where the bestials inside pounce on him. Outside, Bromley apologises to Spidey and tosses the ring, realising the rebels are the only family he has left now. Wonder if this counts as a serial numberless man-spider appearance. At least with the nanobot suit he doesn't need to worry about it getting torn, I suppose. As far as the episode goes, the concept's there, but the execution felt a bit rushed. Bromley being old enough to remember Counter-Earth before the High Evolutionary has been mentioned before, so it's nice to get a bit more elaboration, though it's a bit too brief. Durwood feels underdeveloped too, selling his brother out for a position in the upper city. Maybe if there'd been a bit more build-up before he betrayed them or something. Doesn't really help that he was likely killed at the end too. Still, there are a few plot links they continue to pick up on, such as Peter's homesickness starting to get to him and Tiger being a potential ally. That and Ram's attempted mind control serving as another hint that he wants to usurp the High Evolutionary. As Spidey starts reminiscing about Aunt May, he spots Venom on a solo operation. He pursues, remembering too late that as a symbiote he doesn't trigger spider sense. Seems the writers remembered that this time. He tosses Spidey into a building, which damages the sonics in his suit. Someone watches as Venom heads into an alley, where he's then hit with a beam, forcing the symbiote to separate from him. Spidey recovers and spots the bestials below. Heading down, he discovers Eddie Brock, not that the reunion's a happy one on either side. Spidey thinks back to his first encounter with the symbiote, having found it on board a ship that John crashed while returning from a mission. It bonded with him and slowly took over his mind until he used the noise of a bell to force it off, causing it to bond with Brock. Spidey defeated Venom, who was incarcerated but still bonded to the symbiote. Eventually, he broke through to Cletus Cassidy's cell, unleashing a second symbiote to transform him into Carnage. Speaking of Carnage, he senses something's wrong while working on the synoptic. Meanwhile, Peter brings Brock to the clinic as he's in bad shape. Running tests, Nalco learns he's become so dependent on the symbiote that he'll die if he doesn't bond with it again soon. Despite there being no love lost between Peter and Brock, he agrees to find the symbiote. On the hunt for Venom, Carnage rampages through the basement. Spidey intervenes and their fight takes them to a subway station. Carnage takes some hostages, figuring Spidey will lead him to Venom. Spidey agrees, but it's a bluff to release the hostages before he knocks Carnage into a train. Avoiding machine men, Spidey returns to the alley he discovered Brock. A piece of the symbiote links with him, showing Brock was hit by a weapon called the Theta-Sonic Blaster, apparently developed by a Dr. Borowski. Remembering that Nalco once worked with someone by that name, Spidey next heads to ESU. Brock's starting to form a friendship with Nalco and Shane, figuring that if Spidey fails it might be nice to die a human. Meanwhile, Borowski reports to the High Evolutionary on the success of the Theta-Sonic Blaster. Turns out High Evolutionary didn't trust the symbiotes and had the blaster developed as a means of destroying them. Spidey keeps watch and spots a container that he learns contains a symbiote. Grabbing it, he flees with machine men in pursuit. Unfortunately, they hit the container, leaving Spidey worried it'll get on him. Realising the symbiote's dying too, he ultimately decides to act as a host. On the plus side, this does grant him the suit's perks and allows him to evade the machine men much more easily. Brock continues bonding with Nalco and Shane when the doorbell rings. Turns out their guest is Carnage, who picked up on Brock's location when the symbiote bonded with Spidey. Spidey makes it back and gets caught in a fight with Carnage as the symbiote leaves him, freeing a captive Nalco and Shane. The symbiote crawls to Brock, who decides to take a chance with it if it means he can protect the mother and son. Venom attacks Carnage, bringing the fight outside. A machine man approaches, carrying the Theta-Sonic Blaster. Venom takes care of it before turning his attention to Spidey, once again completely under the symbiote's control. Spidey manages to grab the blaster, but it's jammed. He dials it up to overload it, which causes a blast strong enough to send the symbiotes running for now. Nalco's not pleased that a clinic was caught in the crossfire, adding to Spidey's usual guilt. Borowski, who was hoping to study the symbiote more, is taken away by Ram for failing the High Evolutionary. First things first, this is likely the fight with Venom that Spidey was talking about in the previous episode, suggesting they headed out of order, not really worrying about continuity. Second big thing is this one being one of the big reasons people treat this series as a sequel to the previous one. Starts off similar to the alien costume story, but remember that Brock was separated from the Venom symbiote at the end of it. Cassidy was also much more on board with becoming Carnage too, which contradicts what's shown here. That and the whole Dormammu business, but if I keep going on, we'll be here all day. With all that said, I do remember this episode being a highlight, and rewatching it now I'd say that's still true. Venom being one of the few transplants the mandates allowed, meant we got a more familiar antagonism going on, both with and without the symbiote. Good moment for Peter too, knowing that their hatred's mutual but being unable to simply let Brock die. That and his fear the symbiote will start getting in his head again even if nothing comes of it. Either way, seeing the black suit serves as a nice bit of extra familiarity. Another highlight is that while he may not know of the synoptic, High Evolutionary is smart enough to know the symbiotes are up to something, hence the weapon that kicks off the plot. It's also nice seeing that even with his enmity towards Peter, Brock does still have the capability to be a decent person underneath it all. Being able to hang on long enough to save Nalco and Shane shows us that much, plus it harkens back to how Venom and Carnage are usually portrayed as enemies. It's never outright said, but as I said back in episode 3, the implication seems to be the synoptics keeping them under mind control to some degree, as Venom seems to come back to Carnage's way of thinking pretty quickly. Overall, great episode that manages to stay well paced. Peter's busy photographing a goodwill effort, even with Munyo breathing down his neck for something more tabloid in nature. He spots Karen out in the open, who's visiting the graves of her parents. Her tag jam has clearly failed her, as machine men descend upon her. Peter hesitates as there are too many people around for him to suit up. Seeing the local priest about to be stomped, he intervenes, but Karen's carried off. Spidey heads to the rebels and informs them what happened. X-51 has a plan that requires a second person, so Spidey steps up to help. Meanwhile, Ram's showing the High Evolutionary around a recently rebuilt lab when Karen's brought in. A rip in her coat exposes a mark on her shoulder, causing High Evolutionary to flash back and recognise her as a baby. Despite Ram's protests, he orders Karen to be taken care of with more hospitality than the usual human. X-51 manages to infiltrate the Machine Men's central security hub with Spider-Man hitching a ride inside. The plan is to hack the central processor and find Karen, with Spidey downloading additional data and codes while X-51 hacks the encryptions. Speaking of Karen and data, High Evolutionary runs scans and realises they are indeed related, grandfather and granddaughter for anyone curious. Karen's unaware, more interested in escaping as Vermin tries to interrogate her. She's blocked by a force field surrounding her room tuned to her DNA, as the High Evolutionary reveals. Spidey manages to get about 90% of the data when security's alerted. They escape through the roof thanks to X-51, but his flight controls are damaged. Surfing across the water, Spidey takes care of the pursuing machine men. More are coming, so they dive underneath. Back at the rebel base, Bromley analyses what they have but finds a glitch. Said glitch turns out to be a homing signal tuned to their base, forcing everyone out with about half the retrieved data analysed. As High Evolutionary hints at Karen's connection to him, Bromley manages to lock in on her location. John decides that subtlety isn't an option and decides to attack Wundagore Castle outright. Good thing too, as High Evolutionary plans to turn Karen bestial. Before she can be carried off, the rebels' assault begins. Spidey uses a machine man to break a hole and get inside. Making use of his cloaking, he searches the castle and finds Karen. She tells him of the force field, so Spidey tries carrying her close, successfully getting her out thanks to it being confused by two entities close together. The pair run into High Evolutionary as they make their escape. He attacks Spidey, suspecting the two have something going on. Karen tries to fight him, but he shrugs off most of it. It's only when she begs him to stop that he lapses, flashing back to her parents and deciding to back off. Karen returns to the rebels, though with their base compromised, Spidey suggests setting up at Coney Island due to its proximity to the central processor. Each major rebel has gotten a backstory episode so far, so it was inevitable Karen gets one too. Kind of interesting that, for as tough and resourceful a fighter as Karen can be, it's a moment of her showing weakness that causes the High Evolutionary to back off. Never really said what he did to her as a baby or why, but either way it would likely cause her to hate him even more if she ever found out about their connection. Starting to build towards a finale here too. We've got the rebels actually assaulting Wundagore, as well as being forced out of the base they've been using for the season. Not to get too far ahead yet, but X-51 managing to get to the Machine Men's central processor was going to have some payoff too. We'll get to it. The High Evolutionary's grown tired of his increasingly large list of enemies. Tiger suggests being diplomatic, but Ram chastises him, and High Evolutionary decides to put a large-scale plan into motion. Meanwhile, Spidey reflects that maybe his time on Counter-Earth hasn't been all bad, just as he spots an army of machine men above. They pay him no attention, leading him to realise something else is going on. Spidey spots the machine men setting up electronic blockades around the basement. They then storm the buildings, forcing the humans inside to vacate peacefully or face arrest. Even Naoko's not safe despite having valid paperwork, as they've decided that she's an associate of Spider-Man. Watching from outside, Spidey causes some noise to draw the machine men away. Entering the clinic as Peter, they watch as High Evolutionary broadcasts a message intended to draw him and the rebels out. To prove he isn't bluffing, he starts wrecking buildings across the basement, something Venom and Carnage find amusing. Ram targets a building despite Tiger's protests, as it's High Evolutionary's orders. Spidey swings in and smashes the weapon before it fires. Despite his best efforts, Spidey's outnumbered and trapped under rubble. Ram moves in for the kill, but Tiger intervenes, arguing that he was supposed to be brought in alive. This gives Spidey enough time to break free, while the rest of the knights are waiting. He's still heavily outnumbered, but by this point the rebels have organised to provide some backup fire. Despite forcing the knights to retreat, the reception the rebels receive is less than a warm one. Tiger reports to the High Evolutionary, who unleashes a sonic weapon that knocks everyone unconscious. Venom and Carnage watch amused, unaware the machine men are closing in. Dr. Borowski is hinted to still be alive, as it's his tech they use to bring the pair down. Spidey wakes up caged in a lab alongside the rebels, as well as Brock and Cassidy, now separated from their symbiotes. Brock informs them Karen was taken to Wundagore Castle as the High Evolutionary enters. Is sonic weapon a success? He hooks up Spidey and the rebels to it, intending to amplify its power to wipe out every human. Tiger protests, but he threatens to add the Knight to the mix if he doesn't keep quiet. As the hero's brainwaves causes the humans to collapse, Spidey realises he might be able to counter it with his suit's sonic device. Activating it proves successful, even managing to disable his and the rebels' cages. High Evolutionary is not pleased, launching a psychic attack on Spidey. As the rebels fight the Knights, Spidey's tossed around by High Evolutionary's attack. As he's about to finish Spidey, he's hit by a pumpkin bomb. A still alive Green Goblin arrives on the scene, revealing the blast from the Solaris 2 tossed him into the Rejects' tunnels, where they healed and formed a friendship with him. High Evolutionary turns his attention to Goblin, allowing Spidey to fire an impact web at him. He then kicks him into a console and electrifies him, while John orders everyone to head to Wundagore Castle. Tiger decides to let them go, knowing the fight's lost. Returning to Brock and Cassidy, the former tells them the Synoptic worked up a failsafe after the last time he was separated. Said failsafe being to activate and fire symbiotes across Counter-Earth. The stakes certainly got raised for this one, as a good finale should do. Action ramped up across the city and everyone serving an active role. Spidey managing to save the day with his sonics countering High Evolutionary's weapon shows the Parker mind at work too. Also got some good seeds going with Goblin's survival, as well as Tiger's increased sympathy towards humanity, suggesting he was about to defect. Even the Synoptic angle further raising tension had potential for a good second part, so it's a pity this was the last episode they finished before cancellation. Fortunately, Larry Brody, one of the writers who pretty much spearheaded the second half of the series, uploaded some info on Season 2, which would have gone to a potential episode 24, to his site TV Writer. The site's defunct, but is still accessible through the Wayback Archive. Proposals were written for up to episode 18, and he even provided a script for how episode 14 would have played out. I'll use the screen caps I have to try and illustrate the events as best I can. First up is the most detached story point, that being Karen. With the symbiotes attacking, she would have been able to escape, with the Vulture coming to help as Wundagore Castle collapsed. Elsewhere, despite the danger, the Machine Men attempt to continue their herding of humans. This leads X-51 to upload his unique programming chemistry to the central processor, sacrificing his individuality but pacifying the other Machine Men. Nalco and Shane would have fared somewhat at first, fashioning a sonic device with an ultrasound machine and some medical equipment. It wouldn't have lasted, and symbiotes and machine men would have invaded. Goblin would have intervened, having separated from Spidey's group and unmasking to reveal he was in fact Hector Jones. Not that there would have been much time for a family reunion, with the symbiotes still proving a threat. For the bulk of the plot, Spidey and the rebels would have escaped the High Evolutionary's lab, which would collapse thanks to the Synoptic's eruption. They'd have encountered Tiger, who'd informed them that Ram and the High Evolutionary were killed in the destruction. Despite some tensions, he agrees to help the group, providing a transport to ESU in hopes of using Borowski's Theta-Sonic tech to counter the symbiotes. The transport would have a container inside holding the two main symbiotes. Cassidy would have returned to Carnage willingly, while Brock less so with Venom. The rest are able to escape after a fight with the symbiotes, but Bromley gets assimilated by the Synoptic. Making it to ESU, they find Borowski, who informs them that he can't generate a weapon powerful enough to fight the entire Synoptic. Tiger suggests using the High Evolutionary's spy satellites to amplify the Theta-Sonic Blaster's signal, as there's a transmitter they can use on the roof. Spidey and John head up to fix the transmitter, which was damaged in the initial eruption. Unfortunately, John took an injury that damaged his biochip, causing him to transform into Man-Wolf once again. Spidey takes him out with a Theta-Sonic blast after a scuffle. Spidey rewires the transmitter as symbiotes overwhelm Tiger and the others. Luckily, Tiger's able to hijack the satellites before he's completely taken over, and the Theta-Sonic blaster's signal is amplified, forcing the Synoptic back underground. The episode ends with a now human again Bromley crying out in fear as something looms over him. Real pity we never got this animated, as even in script form it sounds like it would have been a high action conclusion to the story. Concrete confirmation of the Goblin, even if it was obvious, pulling from characters and plot points and bringing them together in a way that would have seen a method of fighting off a seemingly impossible foe. Could have even retained the end of season cliffhanger given Bromley's final shot. If nothing else, at least the script shows the writers were indeed prepared. In a do-over, I'd probably sacrifice the Craven episode for this. Not that I found that one bad, but it's the episode most easily cut without losing too much of the overarching narrative. Of course, 25 years on, all I can do is speculate about what could have been. Episode 15 would have been about setting up the new status quo, with Tiger and the rebels working towards peace and trying to form a coalition government. With Hector back with his family, Peter decides to leave the clinic, not wanting to be a third wheel. Hopefully he got an apology from Hector for being so paranoid before going. He also would have come up against Black Cat, or rather three sisters that all use the name Black Cat. Chances are Jennifer Hale would have voiced at least one. In episode 16, Karen and Spidey act as ambassadors for the human side of the new government. Karen would be the target of someone known as Nightwalker, who's targeting rebels. Suspects would have included a bestial fanatic, one of the surviving knights, and even John and Bromley. Episode 17 saw Peter taking part in a movie, with his co-star being Counter-Earth's Mary Jane. It would have also involved a villain named Scramble, who from the synopsis sounds reminiscent of a Clayface episode of Batman the Animated Series. Things come to a head again with episode 18, seeing Venom and Carnage fused together as a creature calling itself King Carnage. The Synoptic would have used King Carnage to locate the High Evolutionary's portal, in an attempt to head to regular Earth. Spidey, Goblin and John would have teamed up to fight it, and while the portal would be located, John would get through, but it would be destroyed before Spidey's able to join him. At least John would be able to repair Spidey's reputation, and presumably this would have been the episode to put a cap on the whole Synoptic storyline too. From there, the final few episodes' overarching story would focus on finding the Solaris One. Episode ideas pitched include another team up with the Goblin, another encounter with Electro, a journey into Counter-Earth's Wakanda and meeting with its Black Panther, and learning that Ursula had set up as a Russian crime boss. The finale would have been a final battle against the High Evolutionary and Ram, having survived the rubble collapse. Following their final defeat, Spidey would have at last gotten hold of the Solaris One and headed home. With all of that in mind, my verdict upon rewatching this series after over 20 years is I actually enjoyed it. I have my criticisms certainly, as not every episode landed. I felt some characters like Ursula were underdeveloped, and some parts felt rushed, but it's something different from the norm and the writers set up a decent world with what they were given. One standout I enjoyed was giving more spotlight to John Jameson. For a character who's been around since the beginning, he doesn't seem to get much to do in the adaptations I've seen. The 90s series and Spectacular Spider-Man having been the one to bring in the symbiote, which, as mentioned, is probably a contributor to this series being seen as a sequel by some. Spectacular also gave him a brief stint as Colonel Jupiter, which didn't end well. Speaking of not ending well, the less said of his treatment in the second Raimi film, the better. With that said, it was nice to see an ally we don't normally get a lot of. There's certainly a stubbornness similar to his father, but he's also a fearless fighter who can't turn away from injustice. Similar to Spidey in that case, honestly, which, despite clashing over staying on Counter-Earth, does its job of showing their camaraderie in an unknown world. I think a lot of the stigma for this series was just a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was coming off the heels of a popular adaptation, and likely just felt too alien a premise for the likes of Peter Parker. Maybe if they'd been a bit less gun-shy with pitching it as Spider-Man 2099, it may have been more fondly remembered, and may well have gotten that second season. Still, could be worse. The Silver Surfer cartoon airing around this time ended with the entire universe being destroyed. Nowadays, with some versions of Spider-Man being more sci-fi in nature, this series could have stood alongside them and potentially been better received. If these videos have made you curious, I'd say go check it out, see what you think. Until next time.